questions. But in previous years, we spent a lot of time focusing on what's happening at the federal level and not a lot of time focusing on what's happening at the state and local level. And I know from my own experience as a local regulator for the city of Los Angeles, I know that this movement is fueled by the work of folks on the ground who are doing the work. And it's difficult work to do the work on the inside. And I really want to just say thank you to my colleagues and friends who I'm sitting here with today for doing this work. Many of them have been in this work for just as long as I have, and have been doing it with a smile on their face, and have held such dynamic roles in this space. And I was hoping that through today's conversation, they could take some time, share some insights with you all about their experiences personally as regulators, so that you all can get a sense of the journey of their jurisdictions through the eyes of the regulators themselves. And I am going to start with my colleague Nicole, in part because I met Nicole first, because I was a local regulator in the city of Los Angeles. Nicole was a local regulator for the city of San Francisco. And we worked very closely with one another. And you'll hear as the rest of my colleagues and friends communicate this, but these women are so smart, so intelligent, and have such a command not only of their respective markets, but of the policy, and I think of the expertise that's needed to move this conversation forward. So, of course, a little bit later I'll be back up here to share the federal cannabis update, but I'm really pleased that I'll get to start this conversation with friends and colleagues. So, Nicole, if you could share a little bit about California's experience with cannabis regulation over the course of the past decade, from your perspective, first as a local cannabis regulator, and now as the lead regulator for the state of California. I still think of it as the largest cannabis market in the United States. What has that experience been like? What have your challenges been? What are your priorities to date? These folks are at your ability to talk about anything for an extended period of time, but I've asked them to share about 7 to 8 minutes of remarks so that we can leave some time for questions from the audience before we get done. We'll start with my colleague and friend Nicole.
Thanks, Kat, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you guys today. As Kat said, we have a framework of the things to discuss with you guys, so I have some bullet points here to keep me on track, because when Kat says I do. But first I want to say thank you for saying thank you. We have a joke in camera, which is the National Cannabis Regulators Association, to hug a regulator, because it's a really tough job. And so we always appreciate when we have gratitude expressed for the blood, sweat, and tears that we pour into the work that we do. So thank you. And I also want to say, I know there's a lot of beef between which market's bigger, California or Michigan. I'm just going to say I think California still holds the crown by units. So I just want to throw that out there. All love to Brian and his team. Okay, so for California, California's journey has been reflective of everything that is California, right? It's been ahead of its time. It's been big. It's been messy. It's been complex. And as you guys know, California was the first state to legalize medical in 1996. And when that happened, there wasn't a lot of framework thrown around that exercise. So in 2016, when Prop 64 passed and adult use started to come into play, our challenge as a state was, not necessarily starting from scratch, but really bringing order to what was a large, entrenched, sprawling market that covered the state and moving into a commercial adult use framework. So I jumped into that challenge head first, as Kat mentioned, as a local regulator in San Francisco, where I was tasked with sort of elegantly bringing adult use activity into a a city and county really with a rich history of medical cannabis activity and doing that in a way that really respected what came before it, the patients, the medical side, and also, and very much so, those operators, those individuals who had been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. So with an equity program leading the way. So my task was really to work with policymakers to develop and implement an equity program that was comprehensive, that was thoughtful, that could withstand legal scrutiny over time, as we're all starting to see across the nation in a couple of districts. As well as to run an amnesty program that sought to bring into compliance or start to bring into compliance the entire supply chain that San Francisco had ignored. So there had always been a retail aspect to San Francisco's medical and regulatory framework, but there had never been everything else of the supply chain. So figuring out how we identify where those operators were, how we stabilize them where we could, and move them where we needed to into a place of compliance. Through that, there were max 3 of us working in that office, working with a bunch of other city and county departments, public health, building department, planning department, to try and get those guys stabilized. And it was a real balance of trying to move government quickly through soft power, yet mayor, who was very supportive, and as a city and county, it made it more possible for us to move a little bit more nimbly with the needs of the operators and making sure that they had a smooth pathway into January 1st, 2018, when commercial activity started to kick in. But there were also some additional challenges, one of them notably being, the state didn't really give locals much, insight into what plans were, much say into how that would work in those jurisdictions. And so when Gavin Newsom became governor, I moved to the state to try and tackle those challenges from the state level. And that meant not just the work I'm doing now, which I'll speak about, but it also meant some other really fun stuff, right? So we, worked with policymakers to develop the first of its kind, or are developing the first of its kind appellations program, support research grants, which is part of the Prop 64 Cannabis Tax Fund allocation. Every year, $10 million is set aside to support California academic research in the cannabis space, coordinating enforcement across a bunch of different agencies, and of course, investing millions of dollars into equity programs across the state as well. But it also meant tackling good government. And there were 3 programs at the time. When I moved to the state, there were 3 licensing and regulatory programs scattered across the 3 agencies, and that was just very ineffective. So we took on the big challenge of folding that into one department, which is the department I now run. That was set up in 2021. And now, we've taken on the issue of regulatory streamlining. Note that is an ongoing issue. We meet regularly to continue to iterate our regulatory structure. We have leveraged the tools the state baked into those 3 programs, now one department, to be way more effective. Things like our track and trace system, for instance. And now we're a department of 660 people that have a $175 million budget and about 8,000 licenses. So it is a beast of an exercise out of California's taken on. And as far as our market goes, we've seen billions of dollars made in sales since 2018, but our illicit market is extraordinarily strong, very strong. And a lot of that goes back to Prop 215. We have a sprawling market. It's deeply entrenched, and you see that reflected in the work that continues to go through operations. You see that reflected in consumer sentiment, consumer behavior. And not to mention, only 50% of cities and counties in the state of California are permissible or allow retail access in those jurisdictions. So we have huge swaths of our state that are not served by the legal market. So priorities now, clarity and stability, grounding our work in data. We brought on an economist from UC Davis, or previously UC Davis, ERA Economics, which assesses every year the health of our market grounded in data, so that and that is a public report that we share. It's on our website if you guys would like to see it. We're streamlining our operations continuously, as I mentioned, and really maxing out the tools that the state has given us: track and trace, condition licenses, emergency decisions and orders. We're doing a culture shift within the department as well as within state government. I can't underscore this enough. It's been a huge journey. When I started, cannabis was sort of an afterthought, and now I'm starting to see 7 years later, it's very much ingrained in the operations and the work and the mentality of the people who are across the executive branch, which is awesome to see. It's been an incredible transformation. And then, of course, budget reform. We recently, this last budget, shifted all of our enforcement costs off the backs of our licensees. We've moved it into the tax fund, so now taxes pay for all enforcement for the department, our law enforcement, and any additional enforcement that occurs in the licensed market, specifically to unlicensed activity, if that makes sense. And that's an enormous amount. That's almost half of our budget. Our challenges continue to be the same challenges probably so many of these jurisdictions face, and that are well known. Federal inaction continues to drag down the progress of the state. The illicit, as I mentioned, scale in California is daunting. For every 1 pound of cannabis produced in the state, roughly 8 pounds of illegal cannabis is produced in the state. And just to give you a sense of the challenge, the nuance that we're looking at, and the data that's informing our work, 60% of consumption in the state of California is from an illegal source, 40% uptake in our legal market, but 88% of consumers say they would purchase cannabis from a legal source, and 85% of people in impermissible areas incorrectly believe it's legal for them, or don't know if it's legal for them to purchase in their jurisdiction. So really looking at that 50% and figuring out how we can tackle the issue of safe access of legal retail in those jurisdictions with our local partners. And then obviously it continues to be a challenge in this space to balance health, equity, environment, stability, sustainability. These are complex issues, and as a regulator, taking on all of that at once can be a very challenging thing. And what you guys hear in the media is a reflection of that, right? The media doesn't do well with nuance, doesn't do well with complexity, and it doesn't do stories on steady wins. So there is progress being made in California. You don't always read about it, but we see it, and we are very crystal clear on what our path needs to be moving forward: stabilizing markets, stabilizing consumers, supporting local governments, data systems, and then obviously preparing for federal reform and watching things like how states are taking on hemp integration. California has a bill that's a few weeks out from potentially making California another state that will do that. Watching psychedelics rights in Colorado has been extraordinarily helpful to the state of California on that front. Making sure that we're learning those lessons, because we know trying to go back and clear that up is an extraordinarily large undertaking, even bigger than doing it right from the start. And then just a personal reflection before I wrap. When I moved to the state, what I found is that a lot of the problems are the same, right? The scale is just bigger. And a lot of it is about how you make good government move faster. And we all chuckle because it's a very challenging thing to do. But when you do it, it can make a huge difference. On the local level, you see that really immediately. On the state side, sometimes it can take time, and I'm sure on the federal side, it could take even more time to see. But it's a really important exercise to keep the heart of everything that we're doing here. With that, I'll close out, and looking forward to questions in the discussion.
Can we give a round of applause? Yeah, I told her, I was like, we're going to start with you. You'll do excellent. And you did it. So thank you so much. I didn't have any other expectation. Tabitha, I think we'll just go down the line, come to you next. And part of the reason why I was so excited about having the opportunity to moderate this panel again, I'm going to use the word dynamic a lot when describing these women, in part because they've held roles, and you can see from going from state to local level, safe to safe, substance to substance. There's so many lessons that we learned, and I think it's so important for us to be in communication, regulators to be in communication with one another so that we can learn these lessons. And the value that's brought when jurisdictions are able to bring on leadership with prior experience, and having the state of Maryland is extremely blessed to have you in this leadership role after your experience in New York. So if you can talk and share some of those insights, both from your experience in New York and now as the lead regulator for the state of Maryland.
Thank you, Kat, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Cannabis is obviously our specialty. It's like weird to think about having a specialty in this very niche industry. I will say that I was with New York for 3 years since the start of that agency up until earlier this year when I joined Maryland. Very different states. And it's interesting. I get a lot of questions in Maryland about, don't do what you did in New York. Why did you guys mess that up in New York? And my second favorite thing is to defend New York and to say that actually the regulators got it right in New York. The actors who got it wrong were the ones who paid the regulators, and so, we have losses too. A lot of the lessons from New York I carried with me to Maryland and plan to implement them in Maryland. So one of the things that I think New York did extremely well was equity. New York has the largest equity program in the country. Of the operational dispensaries, about 85 to 90% of them count as equity, which is phenomenal. New York is also the largest market on the East Coast. So when you start putting those things together, it proves very clearly that equity does translate into dollars. Right? I know there's often a lot of talk within cannabis and in other disciplines as well as should we focus on profits or should we focus on equity? Should we make money or should we feel good? Should we make money or should we think about morality? And New York has demonstrated that actually you can do both, right? You can correct for the harms perpetuated by the war on drugs, and you can build the largest market on the East Coast. And mind you, that market, and that market was built essentially the first dispensary in New York opened on December 29th, 2022. So we're not even 3 years in to the largest market on the East Coast that focused on equity, but 85 to 90% of those dispensaries are equity. So let's just say equity wins. I take that with me to Maryland. Maryland, like many other states, developed an equity program later on, whereas New York opened the market with equity. Maryland sort of took lessons from the broader market and built an equity program later. Maryland issued in 2024 the first social equity only lottery-based licensing round across the entire supply chain. So whereas New York, for example, focused on dispensaries, Maryland developed a program that looks at all 3 license types. In Maryland, there are growers, processors, and dispensaries. That equity program is something we're rolling out now. And we have about 144 licensees that are getting operational. We're walking them through the process. They are building on facilities, they're getting zoning approvals, and that constitutes, I'd say, the bulk of what the agency is sort of humming about and buzzing about right now. I share this with you because it means that there are large opportunities to be involved in Maryland's market. One of my main priorities for the market is for it to grow. And that growth, again, with my theory that New York proved that equity equals economic opportunity, economic growth, we're trying to do the same thing in Maryland. We are trying to open up these businesses. We are looking for ways to support them. We are having conversations with municipalities for them to get that zoning approval. We are issuing extensions, noting that oftentimes a hurdle is that zoning approval, is the fire marshal, right? Those are not things that we're going to hold against the licensee. We are gathering data. We're looking at what their partnerships look like in terms of operating agreements, loan agreements, How are they funding these businesses? With whom are they working? And what do these patterns show us as regulators in terms of opportunities? Right? If we see, oh, it looks like there are a couple of credit unions who seem to be really involved in the space, great. Then set up a call with those credit unions, let's see what information they need to scale. How can we provide that for them? As regulators, we sit on mountains and mountains of data. It's actually a really beautiful thing. I think many of us are still trying to figure out who can we hire to look at this? Are they going to stay long enough to really dive into the data, clean the data, and organize it? But that data can be leveraged to support economic opportunity, right? We use it internally to make decisions. And we also want to share it strategically such that interested stakeholders can measure risk, right? Can do the calculation that they need to do in order to realize how this relationship can be profitable. And so that's something that we're thinking through in Maryland quite deeply. In New York, I'm sure many of you have heard about the two-party of interest framework. I take about 97% of credit for building that and writing those regulations. A lot of people complained about it, but what it really is a system of disclosures. Right? It is a system for the regulators to keep track of who is in this market, not just whose name is on the license, because hey, we know that often doesn't mean too much, but rather who's pulling the strings here, who are the interested parties in this industry, what are their names, where do they live, are they following the rules, how much are they investing, what are the terms of those investments, are there balloon payments, what kind of payment plans are they setting up, what's the term of this agreement. All of those data points inform the regulators so that we can then make decisions to facilitate further activity. In Maryland, we are looking to build something similar. Again, a disclosure-based system whereby we can keep track. The SEC does this, right? If you invest in public equities, they are tracking you, right? They are looking at investments, they're looking at all of those terms. Those companies then release annual reports, quarterly reports. If you trade over a certain threshold, they're tracking that too. And I really think it's time for cannabis stakeholders to become accustomed to that pattern. Us as regulators, we are regulating a federally controlled substance. We need eyes. We need to know what's happening. And so that's just one of the things that we're looking to do in Maryland. I'll close out with a few more points. Maryland has a very strong regulated market, exceptionally strong. One of the reasons I think we're able to succeed so much is because we are a smaller state. Scale matters here. And as a smaller state, it means that there's a lot more coordination that can go on between agencies. The illicit market in Maryland, for example, is relatively under control. I say relatively because there's always room for improvement, as regulators know that. But there are a lot of the attention taking place on the illicit THC market is handled by a separate agency. That separate agency also does tobacco and alcohol enforcement. So this is their specialty. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. As regulators, we can focus on growing the market. We focus on sort of the positive attributes, and less so in terms of the enforcement. Right? It means that you don't see the same split that you do. Maryland also has a strong medical market that it's maintaining relative to its adult use market. In many states, as adult use comes online, you see medical sales start to drop. In Maryland, medical sales are about 33% of total sales. We're looking to increase that. We believe that it's a huge untapped market. Maryland is also a medical tourist state. So, a lot of the people come for their medical treatment. The University of Maryland medical system is quite strong. Johns Hopkins medical system is also quite strong. So we're looking to tap into those networks and see how can we leverage what they have going on to better serve cannabis patients. We would love some federal reform to do some things and not others. Frankly, what we hear from a lot of these hospital systems, they're concerned about the federal oversight. But if that is a mountain that we can move successfully, I believe the sales will just quadruple overnight. So lots of potential in Maryland, and we're really excited. Thank you.
And moving on down the line, I'm really excited for your to get a chance to hear from Monique Mark because she's been doing this for quite a while and has had the opportunity, has taken the responsibility of not only leading the charge for cannabis, but also for natural medicine. And I learned so much from you over the years, so I'm really excited for these folks to have the opportunity to do the same.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you to the organizers for having me here. I just really appreciate this opportunity to be among this group and who I've learned so much from and have leaned on as I've been in this role. So again, my name is Dominique, and I'm the Senior Director for the Colorado Department of Revenue's Marijuana Enforcement Division and our New Natural Medicine Division. I joined the division in 2014, and just to back up based on some of the reflections from what my colleagues have just shared with you, and I appreciate that you were touching on just references to mountains, and coming from Colorado, I love backpacking, I love our Rocky Mountains, and I reflect on my experience in the wilderness and backpacking and mountaineering, and can relate it to some of the experience I've had in my regulatory role, where sometimes I am literally running away from storms or into storms, and that's how it feels like sometimes in this space. So having joined the division in 2014, like my colleagues here, the role that I hold currently is not where I started in this space. I refer to my experience within the Marijuana Enforcement Division as sort of having grown up in the division. And I was practicing law, civil litigation, and licensed in Texas and in Colorado. And really inspired by my experience in Texas, having worked with the San Antonio Police Department in volunteer capacity, focusing on crisis intervention and sex crimes, really wanted to shift my career to public service. I was not thinking I want to move into the cannabis space. I really was wanting to focus on public service and make this big change in my career. And so I did that and saw this opportunity with the Marijuana Enforcement Division with a focus on legal related work. So my role started with a backlog of investigations of cases that the division needed assistance with. So I was going through those, reviewing them for legal sufficiency, working with investigators, determining what approach we were going to take, and helping resolve those cases through negotiation and working with our representatives at the Attorney General's office. And so that's where I started. And then from there, my scope of my role grew into policy-related work, so helping develop regulations. And then I got involved in the legislative work of the division, and then began overseeing the implementation of that legislation that led me to overseeing our licensing operations and other parts of our operations across the division, and then became deputy director before I moved into the director role. I'm also the first person to hold the role who is not a law enforcement officer, so I'm the only one not without a badge and gun on my hip walking around. And that is also, I think, been really important to our evolution and shifting certain ways that we operate and the resources we have. As my colleague shared, the areas that we work in involve filling gaps where the otherwise federal agencies would have a very distinct role, like what the FDA would do, or even the data-related work that we have to be focused on that's really critical to doing our work in a diligent manner. So we become more data-driven. We have a data analytics team. We now have scientists on staff. When I first came in, it was a lot of law enforcement staff and administrative staff. So there has been a significant evolution. Also, as a Marijuana Enforcement Division that has been very focused on leading with enforcement at the start, we have really looked at shifting to a culture of compliance and how can we support that as regulators, because we are also a cash-funded agency, which means we need participation by the industry in order to fund our own operations. We have made requests as the market has changed to look to the tax revenue that's generated by operators so that we're not putting all of that funding on operators in this space. And we've been denied multiple times. We just more recently had some support on that front, but we are still just trying to keep our heads above water as an agency. So just to back up a bit on that, we first had our medical program based on Amendment 20. This is a constitutional provision in 2010, and then we had Amendment 64, another also based on our state constitution, that is required that it did allow for some personal use provisions for cannabis and home growing as well as directing the Department of Revenue to stand up a regulatory framework for the state of Colorado. In 2014 is when that was set to launch, and also when I was coming in with your standard supply chain of setting up a process for application and approval for those who want to be a part of the space for the storefronts, cultivation of cannabis, manufacturing products, and then laboratory testing. So interagency coordination is also very critical to the work we do. We work very closely with our partners at the Public Health Department and many other agencies who have a role. And so we're leveraging the expertise across those agencies. That's been really important for us. We have, over the years, have seen, we started with what required every owner, no matter your percentage of ownership or interest, had to go through us, apply, disclose, and be approved. That changed. There's no allowance. There's an express prohibition for publicly traded company involvement. That changed in 2019. There were multiple efforts, multiple bills that either died and then was vetoed before we got involved in supporting the development of legislation that we felt this is something we can implement, and supported that transition that then opened it up for additional investment and ownership opportunities. That same year, we also had a number of other bills passed that included allowances for home delivery of cannabis, as well as on-site consumption, known as hospitality in Colorado. And so those were bills that we implemented all together. It was a huge lift, and we were ready to launch. It would have been 2020, right when we were ready to start taking applications, and then boom, of course, the pandemic hits and everything. The excitement sort of slows at that moment, and so we're just in more recent years starting to see a lot more activity in the home delivery space. We have a number of operators who are providing home delivery services. We also check those. We do underage compliance checks, just like we do for the storefronts where we have somebody underage using their own ID, trying to gain access and make a purchase, and we make sure that we're deploying resources similarly for home delivery to determine compliance. We have 99% compliance. We have for several years, so it's been really important for us to be messaging to folks when there are concerns about youth access, that our data and what we are overseeing is showing that the regulated market is not where youth are accessing these products when there are concerns. And we, as noted, we need to make sure that we are continuing to look at how do we improve how we're doing things and ensure that we're staying on top of that. Another area of evolution that we've seen involves the products in the market. And so we have a lot of lessons learned, and unfortunately had to be reactive to those. And so we've shifted to, with the resources we have, thinking about how can we be more proactive, and a lot of that is coordinating and collaborating with industry in the process. So a lot of innovation in the space. How do we support innovation in a responsible way? Because in earlier years, we were constantly trying to keep pace with what we saw out in the market. And so as a part of that, we looked to our colleagues in other jurisdictions and what they were doing, and that's what inspired what we call an intended use model. And that informs the manufacturing facilities if they're making a particular product, the testing that's required, labeling that's required. A number of other requirements that apply to those products is based on what the intended use of that product is. What is the labeling that's required there? And so from inhaled to for oral consumption, skin and body products, so that we also have this larger audited product category that is doesn't fit into any other category and has to go through some additional approvals because of additional risks that may come into play, like metered dose nasal spray, for example. In those types of products that we would think, okay, the FDA would definitely have a distinct role in this, and there needs to be some additional oversight before we see those out in the market. And these are some things that just, I'm going to get close on time, that also informed some of those lessons that we took into the stand-up of this new program for natural medicine. And I will touch on that a bit, but keep me on time here, Kat. So just referring to some of the notes I have here, when it comes to some of our other successes, include lessons that we had from navigating the pandemic. We had to do a number of overlapping emergency rulemaking sessions, and because the industry was deemed essential in a way that they could continue operating throughout the pandemic. And so we needed to make sure we were shifting things in a way that complied with, at the time, social distancing expectations, and what other ways could we make sure that we were adapting to the expectations and how customers were interacting with licensees. This is where we implemented things like walk up and drive-through services. And we were very present in overseeing that and saw that there was no big issue that came out of it that led us after the height of the pandemic. We were looking at what do we maintain, and we're in a place that we could really push forward even legislative changes that we saw needed to be made in order to maintain those allowances in our rules. And so we appreciated just that opportunity to see how we could speak to the experience around compliance and options for licensees and how they wanted to operate. I don't know if who's familiar or recalls the E-Valley crisis, lung injury cases that CDC had issued a lot of notifications around, and there were deaths that came from that and involving vapes, and so it wasn't, we were looking to lean on all of our other partners and other jurisdictions, and with the resources and skill sets that we had brought in, including scientists, we're able to then very quickly do emergency rulemaking, identify the source of what we believe to be the issue in order to prevent any deaths in Colorado from occurring, working with industry very quickly. So that was a real success for us, and being able to respond very quickly to something that was very serious, and that there were a number of reported deaths across the U.S. We had at the start a challenge with not having strong baseline data at the start of our program, and have since become a lot more data-driven in how we do things. Like Nicole had mentioned, we have a data dashboard that we now make available. It's interactive, that provides a lot of market information that is based on what is reported into our inventory tracking system. It has additional information in there too. It's updated regularly. It's accessible on our website, so we encourage you to take a look at that.
Dominique, can I ask you?
Yes.
Because I want to make sure that we have some time for questions, but I also want folks to be able to hear a couple minutes about the natural medicine program.
Yes.
Shifted into a couple.
Yes, I will do that. And very quickly, so in 2022 is when this was a ballot initiative, though statutory in nature, not constitutional, so the General Assembly can then make some changes to it. The citizens of Colorado, voters in Colorado, pushed this forward and allowed for this, beginning in 2023, allowed for psychedelics to be a part of the personal use allowances in Colorado, as well as directing the state to stand up a regulatory framework. I was, from the voter perspective, thinking this is really cool. I wonder how this is going to work, because we were not contemplated in the original measure. But the General Assembly, because of the work that we're doing, the infrastructure we already had, we recognize this is not the same as cannabis, very different, but pulled us in and had us have a large role in when it comes to licensing and regulating the manufacture, the cultivation, and healing centers is where these sessions can take place. And it begins with psilocybin, so magic mushrooms is a start for the regulated program. There are other substances that can be a part of this in future years. And it's listed out as ibogaine, higher risk profile. So there's a lot of distinctions that we would expect compared to what we just stood up and launched. We just launched this year the regulated program. We have almost 30 operations that have now been approved, and we continue to have applications coming in. But ibogaine is next on the list that can come in, and we are actively looking into that. DMT, so dimethyltryptamine, is the other substance, and then mescaline, excluding peyote. And so this is something that will continue to evolve, and we will look to see how this evolves, knowing that, again, it's a very different program, more therapeutic in nature. It's not something that you get at a storefront and take home. So a lot more we can dive into there.
Thank you so much. All right, and last but certainly not least, my good friend and colleague, Shakia, please share about your experience starting at the state level in Massachusetts and how leading efforts in the city of Boston.
Of course, thank you, Pat. One thing I want to touch on that everyone here has said is that in this industry, we are all the first of our positions, of our, just in this industry in general, right? Whether you legalized in 2014, 1996, we legalized, Massachusetts legalized in 2016. But standing up these industries is no small feat, and we used to always say we were flying the plane as we were building it, and we are. And so there are a lot and a lot more lessons that we will learn as we experience maybe federal legalization, decriminalization, but as we are still building these industries as we go. So just wanted to make a nod to that we are coming into these industries with outside perspectives. One thing that Dominique just touched on is that she was the first in her position who was not a police officer. And being the first in these positions, again, we're offering those perspectives that are usually outside of the format of government. Even if you come from government roles, cannabis is brand new. So I think making sure that you're standing up these industries with people with outside perspectives of enforcement, of law officers, of, you know, in that perspective at all, is very healthy for the industry. It opens us up to legalization that is more equitable, is more perspective forward and future forward. So with that, I'll jump into my journey. I also came from a policy background. I was the director of policy and legislation for a city councilor at the time, and Massachusetts had just legalized in 2016. By September of 2017, we had our commission was standing up. It was a 5-person commission, and I randomly got to my desk a equity policy. And one, I had never seen an equity policy written, and it was about the cannabis industry, which was brand new. And I was the director of policy, so I was told to go over the policy and submit some recommendations on it or ideas that I may have. And I read it, and I was like, I literally, at the time, I was into Snapchat, and I posted it on Snapchat, and was like, I need to be working on this. And I submitted some recommendations to the commission at the time, Shalene Title, and she got back to me. She was like, we weren't even thinking of those things. Like, let's talk more. And at the time, I told my boss that, like, oh, I'm going to be working with her more. And she was like, what do you mean? I'm like, oh, no, I'm not leaving. Unknowingly that I was forecasting that I was literally about to be leaving. And within 3 months, I was working at the commission as the inaugural director of equity and community outreach. And Massachusetts was actually the first state to write equity language into its statute, and not only into its statute and legislation, but into the commission's mission and goals of the commission and what it would do. So a lot of the things that we're talking about, and I'd like to, I know there's a lot of lessons that Massachusetts learned, and that there are states that came on afterward that definitely built upon what we built, but I'd like to toot our horn a lot because Massachusetts is, and Boston specifically too, is a small but powerful state and city. And there's a lot of this regulation that I see, word for word, bar for bar, from Massachusetts, but it's usually left out of the conversation. A lot of places that I go, a lot of places that I speak, I'm the only person there from Massachusetts or Boston, and a person from my background from that city and or state. And so I think it's very important to kind of toot Massachusetts' horn as a leading state in terms of cannabis legislation and regulation. Although we are, and if you've heard anyone talk about Massachusetts, we are the most regulated state for cannabis regulation in, I would say, the nation. We edit and redraft our regulations every 6 months. We're in a regulatory process right now. Regulations are promulgated every 6 months, redrafted and updated every 6 months, and I think it's important, but it's a lot to go through. And in that, a lot of things that you guys touched on, we stood up a trust fund. The lesson that we learned from the trust fund is that the trust fund didn't come online until last year, but we legalized in 2016. And so the money and the capital needs to be available immediately. You cannot do reparative justice without reinvestment immediately. And so that was one of the great faults of ours, that we thought these businesses with technical assistance programs, social equity programs, would be able to stand themselves up with just general assistance. And they need capital. They need these things written into the lines of the state and the city budgets. They don't need to come from tax reinvestment. Tax reinvestment is waiting on a return a fault of the government that you did not do to yourself. And so while we were under this great idea that we would be able to use tax reinvestments for these great things, both at the state and the city level, and written into laws and written into our regulations about where this tax investment money would go. Those things don't usually shake out in practice the way that they are written in statute. And so then you're waiting long times for these businesses to get stood up, to be profitable, for that tax revenue to be filtered through both city and state processes. And then who knows who are the people at these levels deciding where the tax revenue will then go. Massachusetts is also highly taxed, 17% for the state, 3% for each municipality, and then municipalities are able to tax an additional 3%, in community investment fees on these businesses. Boston itself gave back within the first few years of realizing this era, our tax reinvestment funds to all of the businesses totaling about $3 million just between 9 businesses. And so we were able to see that, one, municipalities have no way to really track where these community reinvestment funds are going. We were also able to see from other municipalities in Massachusetts that a large sum of these tax reinvestment funds and community reinvestment funds were going to local police officers, as opposed to just general back into the businesses that are generating them, or to communities disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs and or their families or lineage. And so there were a lot of lessons learned there in terms of that. And I want to go back to the word reinvestment and correct it to reparations. And I know that that's sometimes a trigger word for people because it instantly generates some image in people's head that people need to be paid back for something that happened to them ages ago, and they do though. People do. These things trickle down, just like we know what trickle down economics means and what that looks like in our communities, and just in general. That happens from this. People have been arrested, people have been incarcerated, their family members have been impacted. They were then returned to society and not able to seek education or housing or medical services. And so we need to be taking that into consideration, that reinvestment and reparations are 2 different words, and we need to use them to make sure that we are funding and standing up these industries as they should be, and people who were impacted. And that looks differently in each jurisdiction. We've learned that in Massachusetts, that equity in certain towns looks completely different than the image that people think of when they think of equity, right? And I'm gonna state that image just because I think it's important that when we hear certain words and how they've been used in our society, we have created images that go with them. And when we hear equity, we are immediately thinking, oh, that's Black people. And that's not necessarily so. Have they been the most impacted? Absolutely. Have they been the most incarcerated, discriminated against, arrested disproportionately? Absolutely. Have there been other groups? Absolutely. And there's data to support all of that. And so this is not, equity doesn't leave anybody out. It meets you where you are. It meets you where you have been disproportionately impacted. And so I think that one thing I jotted down when Tabitha was talking is that this definition of equity that pops into my mind all the time, and I'm gonna make a statement in terms of things I've learned in these positions, is that the definition of equity, both in what I just described in terms of the image that we have associated with it and who it's supposed to impact and help, is not necessarily who it is actually for when we're talking about equity in the cannabis industry. However, when we are also standing up these industries and we're talking about equity, we largely and only refer to equity in licensing. And in my position at both the state and now at the city, I immediately came in and designed, I actually designed Massachusetts Social Equity Program. I completely left that out, but I designed Massachusetts Social social equity program. And it has it's a four-tiered program. And it focuses on entrepreneurship, whether you want to have a license or not. It focuses on two workforce development tiers, which are for core workforce development, those who want to be managers, directors, CEOs, etc., and entry-level workforce development, and then an ancillary track. However, even though there's two workforce development tracks, this still prioritizes and held up people who were interested in licensing. We are not thinking about equity in its full encompassment of the word when we're talking about it in terms of regulatory oversight. We are leaving out patients and equity and patients. So in 2018, the Cannabis Control Commission, which is Massachusetts' regulatory body, also took over the medical program, which was formerly overseen by the Department of Health. And we immediately eliminated the registration fee for patients. But we never talked about equity in terms of medical again. We never even addressed removing that fee as a part of equity. We just keep siloing equity into this thing, this other thing that's for these people over here, as opposed to a full, encompassing, holistic approach to regulating. And from that, a lesson that I've learned through my journey is that equity is not a program. And I say everywhere that I go, just so that when we're thinking about this, everyone has mentioned it. We have this equity program, we have this equity program, we have this equity program. When I was working at the state, people used to ask our executive director, what do people ask you most about? And he used to always say, our equity program. It's this big, shiny thing that everybody can say, oh, we have this equity program, but it's not equity. And we're not getting to the patient, we're not getting to the consumer, we're not getting to the entire ecosystem of what the cannabis industry is. And not just the supply chain, because that feeds the market. It doesn't feed the ecosystem. And so part of that is the ancillary businesses that we could also tap into. The workforce development, and again, the patients and consumers, and there's a list and list that feeds into this ecosystem. So I wanted to touch on that as well. And in Boston, as I stated, I am the senior cannabis industry manager. We just now, and my title used to be the cannabis business manager, and I used to just oversee the equity program. So Boston, again, started out with just writing into an ordinance, this is what we're going to stand up. We're going to have an equity fund that funds a position that oversees our equity program and makes sure that our licensees have access to technical assistance and other assistance that this person that is hired will develop. And so I now just hired someone to oversee our equity program and develop it out, and I now oversee the industry and moving Boston as a city into a full perspective of how we want to support the cannabis industry and ecosystem outside of just the licensee, but also above and beyond just this separate equity program, where there are, specific eligibility criteria that you have to meet to be in it and receive those things. But what about everyone else? What about people who just generally need to come to the city and they're interested in cannabis? There was this big gray area where they didn't know who they should reach out to or speak to. When you go to our city websites, we have a website for licensing, and we have a web page for the equity program. There's not a general cannabis hub. And so that's what I'm working on creating right now, and just making sure that, again, the perspective is holistic and fully encompassing of what a cannabis industry, what ecosystem is, with equity infused through the entire industry and ecosystem. I'll stop there, except I do want to add one more thing. And I raised this to Dominique on the panel she was just recently at, and I was listening to her speak. But one thing and one key thing that has been sitting with me for a while, and I'm starting to say it out loud, and that I've been learning through this process of regulation, is that regulation isn't always the best path forward. And are we over-regulating, right? There are going to be questions that come up that's going to say, well, who's going to oversee that? Who's going to put that into place? Who's going to do this? But when does the statute and the legislation go far enough so that we're not standing up these outside regulatory bodies that are imposing more barriers on an industry that we're trying to repeal or not even create, because the market already exists, that we're trying to bring into this fold of regulation and taxation? When have we gone too far in regulation? So I'm leaving that question with you in terms of when is regulation enough and how have we gone too far?
I think it's fair to say that many of these regulators have had full circle moments when you have regulators asking, are we going too far? A little bit of self-reflection there. I do appreciate that Shakia, throughout her career, has continued to say this mantra, equity is not a program. I agree with her wholeheartedly. What we've discussed, and it's real, is that the war on drugs itself is not a program, right? That was every level of government working towards a common goal, lots of different agencies, hundreds of millions of dollars over decades that got us to this point. And if we want to go in a different trajectory, then we need to employ every level of government, all agencies, with millions of dollars over decades, marching in the other direction. And these folks have started that work. So I'll end again with saying thank you for helping to move that pendulum. It's increasingly important. And the other thing, Shakia, that I want to note on before we move to questions is Shakia used the term ecosystem. We've kind of gone back and forth debating what are these terms. She was really like, I don't identify as an industry advocate. Don't call me that. And I say that because I consider myself to be a community advocate. I think that the industry is part of the community. We're trying to figure out a word that represents the whole thing, because that's what we need to be responsible for. And I think that ecosystems is really important in doing that. And I recognize that this particular program is focused on folks in the payments and banking system, and you all are a part of our ecosystem. And in order for not only our industry to be successful, our respective industries and jurisdictions to be successful, but for our communities to be successful, I think that we need to figure out how our ecosystems can better communicate, coordinate, and empower one another. Capital is a real barrier for community, and we're sitting in rooms with folks who work with capital and move capital around. And so my ask and kind of call to action as we're going into the Q&A is for us to think about how we can work together and collaborate with our respective ecosystems to try and help problem solve, because it's really, really important. And I know that we've got a lot to offer, you all have got a lot to offer, and I think that by collaborating, we can get much further. So please join me in thanking these folks one more time.